Hi everyone, it's Father Ryan, and in this video I just want to look at the final kind of point about whether the Gospels are reliable eyewitness accounts. Can we really believe that the Gospels are historical biographies? And a big question is the dating of the Gospels. If they're too late, if there's a lot of time after Jesus' life and death before the Gospels were actually written, how do we know that they're actually based on eyewitness testimonies? And according to many textbooks, the Gospels weren't written until the late first century. And a lot of people believe that they were kind of anonymous. They kind of were stories that circulated around. They were augmented. They were added to until finally they were written down in the late first century. Well, what evidence do we actually have about how the Gospels were written? Well, kind of three stages. So first of all, you have Jesus who, calls his disciples, his students, to follow after him. And they lived with him and followed him and did everything with him for 3 years. It wasn't like they just went to school during the day and went home at night. No, they lived with Jesus for 3 straight years. And Jesus expected them to remember what he said. In the Gospels, the word remember is very important. It recurs all over. And Jesus told them to begin teaching other people while they were still alive. So they had to rehearse, their script. What did Jesus really say? What has he taught us? We have to rehearse. We have to pass it on. We have to teach other people. And so they practiced memorizing and teaching. And then after Jesus' death, the second stage, those students, those disciples remembered what he said and did, and they taught other people. And they were based upon their memories as trained students and the repetition of preaching about what Jesus said and did. And then finally, the third stage, eventually, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the evangelists, they wrote down what they witnessed themselves or what was handed down to them by other eyewitnesses. So the memories of Jesus' students, either the ones who were there with Jesus for 3 years or those who were with those who were with Jesus for 3 years. So Mark was translating and writing down the preaching of St. Peter. And Luke was based on eyewitness accounts, as he says. And so even if the Gospels weren't written until the late first century, as some people believe, Mark and Luke, they probably would have been maybe in their 50s, maybe late 40s. Matthew probably would have been in his 80s. John would have been in his 90s. And in fact, early church fathers talk about how John died a very old man in the year AD 98. So it would be well within the lifetime of Jesus' apostles and their followers. It's not like there was this huge decades-long gap between when the apostles died and the writing of the Gospels. But it's not even certain that the Gospels were written at the end of the first century. There's good reason to believe they were written much earlier. So why is this? Well, in each of the Gospels, Jesus predicts something very important, that the temple would be destroyed. And some people say it's impossible to predict the future. So Jesus could not have accurately remembered or predicted the temple being destroyed. And so the temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD. And so people say, well, this must just have been a recollection of the apostles, kind of after the fact, putting this in their Gospels after the year 70. But the temple had already been destroyed before in the year 586 BC, and there's no reason Jesus, it's recorded in the Old Testament how the temple was destroyed. There's no reason Jesus couldn't have accurately predicted how it was going to be destroyed again. And the destruction of the temple is never described as a past event in the Gospels, like other things are. It's always a future event. And also Jesus tells us, his listeners, those who are listening to him, to pray that it not happen in winter, and warns people in the country not to enter into the city when they see these things. So why would the gospel writers have included something like this if it would have happened already after the fact? And they knew it happened. If they knew it happened in July. And so it didn't happen in the winter, it happened in the summer. So it makes no sense to ask people to pray for something that was a past event. It only makes sense that this was still in the future, that it hadn't happened yet, and that Jesus must have predicted this, and the gospel writers written it before the year 70 AD. Also, everyone agrees that Luke was written after one of the Gospels, or even both of the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Luke himself tells us other narratives were already in existence when he starts writing, and there's a lot of parallels between Luke kind of borrowing from Matthew or Mark or both of them. So Luke is also, we know, the author of the Acts of the Apostles, which he wrote after his Gospel account. And it's really important how the Acts of the Apostles ends. It ends with Luke describing his arrival with Paul in the city of Rome. And that happened in the year AD 62, when Paul was taken into house arrest in Rome. And that's how the Acts of the Apostles ends. It doesn't tell us about Paul's martyrdom, going to his death in the late 60s. And we could ask, why would Luke omit something so important as Peter and Paul's death in imitation of Jesus? And the most obvious answer is that because it hadn't happened yet, that he was writing in the year AD 62, before Paul was killed. And this means Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles and the Gospel before that, before the year AD 62, while Paul and Peter were still alive. And if that's the case, and he borrowed extensively from Matthew and Luke, well then Matthew and Mark must have already been in existence, or both of them. And so this supposed time gap between Jesus' death and the actual writing of the Gospels shrinks to only a couple, maybe a few decades, if they were written in the 60s, early 60s, or even maybe the late 50s for Matthew and Mark. So there's compelling evidence that the Gospel is based upon eyewitness accounts of people who were right there and were still alive, and their memories fresh in their mind as trained students about what Jesus said and did, that their biographies written well within the lifetime of the apostles, and a sound basis for investigating what Jesus really said and did, and who he claimed to be. And to that we turn in our upcoming videos.